Little update on Israel, everybody. Avigal and I were awakened at about 3:30 this morning by another missile attack. Um, Pretty sure they're coming in from Yemen now, even though Israel retaliated this week, and it still doesn't matter. They can have these ballistic missile launchers all over their country and keep shooting them, and it's just going to be a point where Israel's going to make it not worth it for them. So uh, the last attack earlier this week hit a school in Ramat Gan. Luckily, it was at night. The school was empty, but the school was basically destroyed. And that's makes everybody aware that no matter how good Israel's missile defense system is, it is not. We're not hermetically sealed. These are ballistic missiles. They're very fast, very powerful, and they can get through. And even if they don't get through, even when they are destroyed, they're so big that even if the debris falls into Israel, it can cause immense destruction. Um, there's a ongoing sense of hope and disappointment that apparently we're getting closer to a hostage deal. I think it's become apparent to Israelis that the idea that it's been this government's fault that hostages have not come home is slowly dissipating, especially as who is finally on trial for after 8 years of being investigated. He's now on the defense stand, and it turns out that the government case against him for what in my opinion, having watched this very carefully, read the cases, it is certainly not enough to put a prime minister through this during a time of war, or probably even during a sitting tenure. And the case is beginning to fall apart. So there's this great expectation among the detractors of Netanyahu that the man would finally be, his crookedness and his corruption would finally be exposed. It looks like the trial is going to fail. I don't think people will hate him less. I think they'll just say it was a fix. But for those of us who thought this is really wrong, I think we, including me, feel vindicated. Now, I have to remind people when I talk about this, I am not pro Netanyahu. I'm not pro the Supreme Court. I am pro truth and ethics. That's all I really care about. And when people, they're shocked that I hear about truth and ethics, they say, well, how could you think this trial is wrong? I said, because the man hasn't been convicted. And where I come from, you're innocent until proven guilty. And what's shocking for me is how much that ethos does not exist in Israel. It's very disappointing. I'm not saying it exists in America, that people are innocent until proven guilty. What a shock. And I say to people, let it run through the system and see what happens. But I'll give you my personal opinion about what happens during this time. I think there is in many people such an underlying sense of despair and disappointment that there are a few options that human beings have. One option is to to hate somebody. So the the hatred of the situation, the hatred of the war, the hatred of the constant pressure, somebody has to be blamed. Now, I think this is human nature. I see it in families, I see it in individuals, in workplaces, in politics. So the emotional response to other people is disproportionate because of what I call surplus emotions, meaning when one feels great hatred, most people cannot say, okay, I feel hatred, but what are the facts? What's the police report? What exactly happened? And it really takes a kind of an inner life virtue heroism to acknowledge that my feelings are disproportionate from the facts. That's number one. And number two, my feelings might be a displacement on for what's happening inside of me. And again, I see this constantly as well, that people need a place to put their emotions as opposed to do introspective work and try to understand internally where the emotions come from and work them through in an internal way of self-reflection, self-purification even, and then take oneself into the interpersonal world. Well, very few people have those skills. I mean, even people that are trained, thoughtful people, it's a whole other thing to subject yourself continuously to this kind of inner analysis and inner self-regulation. It is just not common, I think, anywhere for anybody. unless you decide to train. And the good thing about it is, as I shared with you, is me, Rob, and I go around and meet people. We avoid angry people. Now and then we'll meet someone who says, "Yeah, I don't like Netanyahu. I oppose his politics. He's right wing. I'm left wing. However, I look at these things and the it's disproportionate to what's actually for what he is actually on trial for." In any case, as the case proceeds, one notices that the press is calming down. And I wonder if this will be a time of reckoning for them because the Israeli press, almost in a monovocal way, has been on a drumbeat to topple the Netanyahu government because it is the quote unquote most corrupt government in Israeli history, putting aside the prime minister who was actually jailed for corruption, Ehud Olmert. Now, what if that's not true? What if he's acquitted on all charges? These 8 years of the constant drumbeat of the most corrupt government in Israeli history, that if he is acquitted, or at least the charges seem to be mostly spurious, my question is, what will happen? My experience has been nobody apologizes. Nobody apologizes. They come around and say, well, even though he was acquitted, look at this. Why? Because that's what my counseling practice is like most of the time. Even when a person finds that they're wrong, hardly anybody ever apologizes. Hardly anybody ever retracts. So that's probably the main thing going on here. The everything else going on, you can read in the papers. There's no special insight here about the defeat of Hezbollah, the fall of Assad, the apparent defanging of Iran, and of course, in general, the general sense of great relief that Israelis feel. They have the strongest support of any American administration in anybody's memory coming in January. So, however you feel, however you voted in the recent election, and there are many Israelis that had they voted, they would not have voted for the incoming president. The feeling here is, from a perspective for Israel, great relief that there is a strong support of Israel coming in, putting aside American politics, whether it's good or bad for America. Israelis first think about, is it good or bad for Israel, as would any country. And and secondly, the awareness that there is such hatred, for disproportionate hatred for Israel in the world, uh, that is, we talk about another time. Is it anti-Semitic, something else? I can talk about that more later. But for Israeli, it's very disheartening and truly incomprehensible, as is all irrational hatred incomprehensible. So I think if the other party had won the election, the sense of isolation would have been increased. And with this administration coming in, again, we don't know what's going to happen, but the general sense here is Israel has a friend in the incoming administration. Right or wrong, it's just the feeling of what's happening in Israel. All right, I can take any questions about any of that after my little presentation tonight. I say little because I only want to talk about one verse, but we all know how that can go. All right, so we've been doing a close reading of the first Torah portion in Genesis, and a few really important things come out. And that is, if you take the lens of what we're taught about God, about Adam and Eve, the snake, uh, uh, um, Cain, Hevel, and so forth. If you take the lens that you were taught out and just read the text is not as we were taught. For example, I was speaking to someone this week and sharing what I'm teaching with you, and this person had been taught that Cain is evil, um, Hevel is good. Uh, Cain stands, as it were, for the devil, and Hevel is the, as it were, archetype of innocence. But when you read the story carefully, and it's very hard for people to realize this, if there's any uh, um, uh, actor, as it were, person active in the plot that comes close to something called evil, it would be, unfortunately speaking, for those of us who love read the Bible, the divine. Cain is set up. We saw this in the last two sessions. Cain is an Oved Adamah, just like his father was a worker of the land. If we try to understand the world from Cain's perspective, or Cain, meaning created being, he's doing what his father did. He's doing what he thought is the divine approved activity. That the Adam, should be Oved Adamah. Adam, human being, Adamah, earth, they're etymologically directly connected to each other. So the idea that Cain would would make an offering from the Adamah and his brother Hevel, who by his name is something of an impermanent interloper. Hevel means vapor. It means mist. It's probably the name that means something like impermanence. So he makes this offering from the flock. God approves of Hevel. We're not told why. Does not approve of Cain. And you can imagine if you thought you were a certain kind of person, you were doing everything that the universe wanted from you, and you offered it, and it was rejected. What would happen to you? Now, in my mind, why is the biblical author doing this? Well, we don't know. We don't know what the biblical author had in mind in producing this, except this is one of the core human experiences that produces human violence. And if human violence coming from human hatred is one of the deepest problems of the human condition, it comes from a sense of shame, of one is not being sufficient. One does not measure up, either in your own eyes or in the eyes of someone else. And it is entirely natural for a human being that once you feel this sense of insufficiency, of not measuring up, one either attacks the self, that I'm a horrible human being, I'm worthless, I don't have any standing within, or you attack that which has made you feel that way. I'll go far as to say that's my understanding of the current conflict here. When I think why so many other Arab countries have made peace with Israel is because the 1948 generation has died. It's something I privately thought. What happens when those who went through 1948 are either have died or gone out of power? The next generation will be much more practical, which has happened all throughout the Arab world, except it uh, those that are, how should I say it, inherently uh, committed to the idea that they can't feel worthwhile as long as Israel exists. This is another way of understanding German anti-Semitism, the shame of having been defeated in World War I. By the way, that they actually weren't defeated, that there was a truce that the Allies interpreted as a victory. Germany was economy was ruined. Lands were taken from them. They thought it was extremely unfair. Now the question was who's to blame? It could be the British, the French, who I think were largely to blame for what happened to Germany after World War I. But there was also a usual suspect, the Jew, who rotted Germany from within. So this constant current of German anti-Semitism was capitalized on by the Nazis, right? And by the way, they did a survey in January 1933, the degree of anti-Semitism in Germany, 10%. But of course, when the Nazis came to power, they made it part of their ideology that the loss of World War I and any failure in Germany in general was due to the Jews. Now, the loss in World War I was profoundly shame-inducing, and this is the horrible acknowledgement. Had it not been for the Versailles Treaty, had it not been for the shaming of Germans after World War I, none of this might have happened. It's a terrible, terrible thing to think how world history would have gone differently had there been better leadership after World War I. I'm thinking like Lincoln, had Lincoln lived, where he said, if you look at his second inaugural, it's time to heal the wounds. It's time for us to recover from this. And I think American history would have gone differently had someone like Lincoln been a world leader after World War I, or someone like Lincoln, if Lincoln himself had lived after the Civil War. So I'm ruminating on the idea, as I shared earlier, and it's an idea that sticks with me, is how profound the idea of shame exists within human beings. If you've never studied this idea, I recommend Gershon Kaufman's books on shame. The rewritten book is called Shame, the Power of Caring. If you have not deeply investigated the idea of shame, you will be aware of how your inner life operates, because shame is, in a sense, an archetype of negative feelings and emotions and thoughts that go on within us that can infect the entire inner ecosystem. So when I was studying this, and I said to myself, "What is this story about?" And then I read that Adam and Eve, Adam and his wife had no shame. Then when they ate from the fruit, they had shame. And then Cain is shamed. I realized that, much to my surprise, because I've never actually had the opportunity to teach this text as I'm teaching it now. The hidden theme of the text is shame. And why would this author talk about this? I think because this is an indelible part of human nature that produces most of our violence against each other, and uh, it produces most of our negative feelings about ourselves. Last thing to remind you, these stories were not, from this perspective, they're not biblical stories. They're in the Bible, but they weren't written for the Bible. The idea that God revealed these are not stories from God. We don't know who wrote the story. We don't know right why they wrote the story, but it was not written for inclusion in the Bible. I want you to think about that for a moment. I mentioned last time that if you look at Genesis chapter 5, where we have a redoing of the story of creation, it goes straight from Adam and Eve to Seth, their third son. Genesis chapter 5 is an attempt to erase chapter 4. Now, what if you never ever read chapter 4? That chapter 5 1. Chapter 5 says, "This is the story of humanity. Adam and Eve had Seth. No Cain, no Abel, no chapter 4 whatsoever." And that's all we knew. I think the Bible would be impoverished had the authors of chapter 5 1. I'm very grateful that the editor said, "We're putting in chapter 5 and chapter 4." This is my quasi comical thinking, because the editor is upset with the author of chapter 5 and said, "You tried to erase chapter 4. How dare you? I'm going to put you in so everybody can see you, and I'm going to expose you because I'm going to put in chapter 4." This is my little cute theory about why the author would put both chapter 4 and chapter 5 in. Now, let's assume only chapter 5 was in, not chapter 4. And then we discovered chapter 4 in some ancient text, and we read the text, not in the Bible, just a story, just a text, some ancient tradition about Cain and Abel. How would we read it? We wouldn't read it through the lens of what God's supposed to be like and Cain's supposed to be like, Abel's supposed to be like. We just read it as it is written. And that's what I'm trying to provide to you. Read these texts as if they're not in the Bible. Read these texts before there was a Bible, because these texts were written before there was a Bible. So the best way to read these texts is as if they're not in the Bible. Now, then, of course, eventually we have to get to, well, they are in the Bible. That would be another step. And therefore, how has biblical commentators understood the text? How has the Midrash understood the text? Have biblical commentators understood the text? This is called, in German, Rezeptionsgeschichte, the history of the reception of the text. That's a valid area of study. For example, how the Cain and Abel story was understood by later generations. That's a worthy area of study, but for myself, I've never had the opportunity to simply read the text as if it were not in the Bible, because again, when the text was written, it was not in the Bible. All right. Now we're to the end of these texts that made it into the Bible, but didn't start in the Bible. And we are at the end of the Torah portion in chapter 6. I'll remind you from last time, chapter 6 begins with two narratives that, again, I think the editor author placed these in because of where it's heading at the end. Where it's heading is the divine is saddened unto the divine soul of what has happened, does not seem to be according to the divine will. If you look at the end of chapter 6, the idea of divine omnipotence is certainly overthrown. The idea of divine omniscience, that the divine knows the future, is overturned. So most theological ideas are actually not in the Bible about God being all knowing, all powerful, all present, and even always good. So all those ideas are disproven in the first Torah portion. So I'll start from the end and go backwards. Chapter 6, verse 5. It says, um, okay, Vayar Adonai ki rabah ra'at hadam ba'aretz. And God saw um, that the evil of the human being was immense, was pervasive. Now, this, when it says Vayar Adonai, God saw, in my mind, this is clearly a kind of an insidious response to the first chapter where it says, and God saw, God saw, God saw, God saw, Kito. God saw it was good. God saw it was good. God saw it was very good. What happens here? You might say the divine finally saw this has all gone terrible. So all the goodness the divine sees in chapter one, okay, is again overturned in chapter six. How have things gone so badly? I want to remind you, my theory is this. If we go into the very first line of Genesis, which I think in a very subtle way propels the story, the first line says, um, uh, in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, and the earth was tohu vavohu. The earth was unformed and void chaos. If we look at the origin of the verse in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 4, it has a moral dimension. The world has morally become utterly corrupt. So the tohu vavohu was in the earth, was in the land, as it were, in this kind of spirit material distinction, not strictly, but roughly. The corruption was in the non-spiritual world, and we'll assign the non-spiritual world to what I'm going to call the inner human life, unaided by spirit, if you may. Meaning there's something called the divine light, divine spirit. Without divine light, without divine spirit, this tohu vavohu never goes out of existence. So then when it says God created light, right? So there's light and things are divided up. It never says in the beginning of Genesis that the tohu vavohu was extinguished, that the moral corruption that was in, as it were, embedded in the universe before the creation story in chapter one, because the tohu vavohu exists before chapter one, verse one. It's already there. There is no creation ex nihilo. We don't have the idea of there is nothing, then God created. Creation happens in the context of tohu vavohu, of unformed, void, chaos. But especially if you look at the origins of the term tohu vavohu in Jeremiah chapter 4, Isaiah chapter 34, it has a strongly moral connotation. Well, that tohu vavohu is never extirpated. It is never drawn out of existence. So in my mind, what we see is because the human being is created from the Adamah, from the land, which in chapter 1 verse 1 is where the tohu vavohu is. It's never taken out. So even though the divine shapes a human being and blows into human being the divine breath, right? It doesn't mean that the tohu vavohu was taken out. It just means the spirit was added in. Now, we are the only beings, according to the Bible, that have both spirit and the Yetzer Hara. Animals have instinct. They're morally neutral. But because we're conscious, we are completely divided between the tohu vavohu on one side, the drive toward moral chaos on one side, and the breath of God within. That is the human condition. So when we get to the very end, where the divine sees the immensity of the evil of the human being, again, we're taken back to the Garden of Eden story, the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, evil has won out, as it were. We're aware there's good and evil, but we just can't control the evil. Now, any of you have ever tried to do anything difficult? From losing weight, getting in shape, stop smoking, whatever the thing is, you know how strong the oppositional force is within you. Just pick your thing. You know there's an oppositional force within you that once it takes hold, it is incredibly difficult to transform. Now, even how much the more so, I'm going to call things like addictions and even addictive kinds of thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc. You can want to try to change yourself, and you can see it happen. You say to yourself, well, I should be a better person. I shouldn't think that way. These feelings are terrible for me. You go right back to it. So the question of how do we, in some conscious part of us, know there's good and evil? We have this thing called the neshama. What does it mean to direct your consciousness to align yourself with neshama and, as it were, try to subdue the tohu, the unformed drive toward chaos within us? That is the human condition. That's what this text teaches. So the divine notices And by the way, shirking any kind of divine responsibility uh, for this. But on the other hand, the way Genesis chapter 1 is set up, it doesn't seem that the divine has the power to extirpate tohu vohu from existence. What a strange idea. There's tohu vohu as the pre-creative setting of the divine. The divine, for reasons that we can only speculate, decides to create, shines light into any of this. But the tohu vohu is never taken out of the cosmos. Is it because the divine is powerless to withdraw, to extirpate the tohu vohu out of existence? Apparently so. So even though the divine, as it were, tries to repair things by putting in light, it doesn't fully address the problem of that moral chaos, which starts as tohu vavohu, ends up being called the Yetzer Hara, the shape of evil. Now, it's a very mysterious thing for me, and therefore, when I look at how the divine behaves in these chapters, there seems to be some tohu vavohu, some chaos even in the divine, which leads to something of a Gnostic interpretation of the divine in the Bible. We see it in the most pronounced fashion in the book of Job. Nobody who can read the text without a lens can be left uneasy with the destructiveness, and I'll even go so far as to say as the evil of the divine in Job. Now, this leads to an idea about the divine called Gnosticism, where there is indeed a higher divine of pure spirit, pure goodness, love, justice, truth, and beauty. But then there is a lower, as it were, divine that is against what you might say the true God, that in many ways governs the lives of human beings. Now, so what is a Gnostic? A Gnostic is someone who knows that this is the case, knows that we are trapped down here in Plato's cave, as it were, and the Gnostic tries to deal with this world of darkness and help try to save yourself and rescue others. The average person, you might say, the non-knower, does not know that we are trapped in Plato's cave is probably the best depiction. So what if, I'm asking myself, what if these stories in Genesis are about the divine that operates in Plato's cave, the divine that operates where we human beings are chained and living in a world that we don't understand, and then someone breaks the chains and sees things as they are. So what if these stories in Genesis are partly about the person, using the metaphor of Plato's cave, who broke the chains and can actually see it's not God in the cave, it's the Gnostic God in the cave, it's the demigod. It's a destructive divine. Now, this goes so far beyond what we think the Bible is teaching. I'm not sure about it. I'm just offering it. But I have studied Gnosticism. I'm a deep student of Gnostic literature, and to realize that the first Genesis 2, 3, and 4 might be part of the Gnostic myth is very disturbing to me, but I'm going to read it. I'm going to take where the reading goes. So um, when the divine says, the God says, Rabba Ra'at Ha'aretz, Rabba Ra'at Hadam Ba'aretz, the evil of the human being is immense in the world. And then it says, V'chol yetzer machshavot libo rak kol hayom, and the shape of the thoughts of his inner life are bent on evil all day long. That's the divine reflection on Genesis, I'll say 2 through 6. And then it says, Vayinachem Adonai ki asa et hadam, and God regretted having made the human being in the world. Vayit atzev el libo, and God was saddened unto his heart. Now, the Hebrew adds ba'aretz, vayinachem Adonai, and God regretted making the human being ba'aretz, on the land, in the world. Again, repeating the word from Genesis chapter 1, that ha'aretz haita tohu vavohu, the world was tohu vavohu, was unformed and void. The word is repeated here. Now, I could be wrong on this, but it's as if the author is saying, um, the fact that the human being is created ba'aretz means the human being is somehow unredeemable. The human being is unredeemable, and God says to God's self, "Good try." Right? I wanted to create a human being, invested the human being with spirit in the eretz, which is the location of tohu vavohu. So by our nature, we are, as it were, morally corrupt. We have tohu vavohu within it because we were made, as it were, of the Lamb. But we also have divine spirit. It's as if the divine is doing a divine thought experiment. And of course, the divine thought experiment means it becomes real. Watching what happens when you oppose divine spirit with tohu vavohu, the second of which is a permanent feature of the cosmos from a biblical perspective, in my opinion. So God says, I'm going to try this. Form something from the Eretz, which is the location of this chaos, of this corruption. Breathe into it the Spirit of God and see what happens. All the time hoping that this being, this Adam, and then eventually the two beings, Adam and Chava, can somehow fight against the power of the Tohu Vavohu, meaning align themselves with the divine spirit, watches it and realize that the test was a failure. It was an abject failure. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 6:5. So from a philosophic anthropological perspective, when one fully understands the human condition, one is sad. To contemplate the human being creates in us great sadness. Now, but of course, that's how the Bible begins. It's not how the Bible proceeds. So, therefore, what is the antidote to this fact of the human condition? That the tohu vavohu is so strong in culture, so strong in nature, so strong in most human beings. So I go to a line from Psalm 119, um, uh, early in the Psalm. Might as well look it up. Psalm 119. By the way, Psalm 119 is an acrostic. So if I memorize a verse from Psalm 19, I know roughly where it is because it's I just have to find out the letter. So Psalm 119, under the Gimel section, here's what it says. As a former and still somewhat existentialist, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, Psalm 119, verse 19. It says, Ger anochi ba'aretz. I'm a stranger in the Eretz. Ger means stranger here. I'm a stranger in this world. So if anybody's ever felt the world is strange to me, I don't fit in, I don't know what's happening. Why am I a stranger to myself? Why don't I act in the way that I want to act? Why is there so much evil? The world is strange to me. I'm a stranger to myself. It says, Al tastir meni, do not hide from me, mitzvotecha, your commandments. I'm going to say your divine guidance. What is the antidote to the Yetzer Hara? Right now, if you can get to the spiritual point where you're a stranger to yourself, that you know you have a Yetzer Hara, either in the way you treat yourself or other people or both. You feel the estrangement. You know you're not how you're supposed to be. You know other people are not how they can be if they lived under the spiritual guidance. What do we do? Well, let's say there is a system, a set of teachings that can help redeem us from this terrible condition called the mitzvot. Now, I don't mean the mitzvot of Orthodox Judaism. I mean mitzvot as urgings from the divine to live a holy life, both spiritually holy and morally holy. What if that existed? The author of Psalm 119, verse 9 is saying, This is also strange to me. Don't hide from me your guidance. Don't hide from me the path you want me to take. So sometimes, when I read this and I say to myself, this is so strange, sometimes so awful, so terrible. From a Gnostic perspective, are we stuck here? Is there no redemption? Or is there a path through? So Psalm 119, verse 9 seems to say there is a path through, but it's hidden. So therefore, the job of the human being is to find that which is hidden, the hidden path. And I think the path can be revealed in so many ways, certainly through the study of any great redemptive literature, great poetry, in my mind, even great cinema, and certainly in the Bible. So the Torah portion is capped with the idea of the Yetzer Hara. So Tohu Vavohu, the chaos in the Eretz, now becomes the Yetzer Hara in the Eretz, the divine reflection that says, in my language, the experiment has failed. It's not worked. The divine is saddened unto the divine soul and says, I'm going to wipe out everything. Um, so it says, um, verse 6, Vayomer Adonai, and God says, Emche et ha'adam asher barati. I will wipe out the human being whom I have created, me'al pnei ha'adamah, from the face of the earth, me adam ad behema, ad remes, va'ad ov hashamayim, ki nichamti ki asitem. So as it were, Genesis chapter 1 is reversed. I'm going to wipe out the human being. I'm going to wipe out the animals. I'm going to wipe out the insects. I'm going to wipe out everything. The whole thing has gone so bad. I'm going to wipe everything out. So I call this the divine nihilism. The divine says it's gone so badly. The only thing to do is wipe everything out and forget about this idea that there can possibly be a being where the tohu vavohu, which is written into the cosmos, can be somehow subdued by the light that God introduced into the cosmos. The struggle between the light and the Yetzer Hara. The divine says, "I've been defeated. I've been defeated." This is chapter uh, verse 7, and then it says, "Noach matza chen be'enei Adonai." However, Noah found favor in God's eyes. So suddenly at the end of the Torah portion, and the editors did a beautiful thing here. They could have ended the Torah portion with I'm going to wipe out everything, and they begun the next Torah portion that they called Noah with that last verse. Right? End here and then start the Noah story in the next Torah portion. However, whoever divided the Torah into Torah portions put the introduction of Noah at the end of the first portion, as to say, as we're brought down to this horrible journey down to divine nihilism. Then the editor author says, however, Noah found favor in God's eyes. There's one little spark of redemption that takes us into the Noah story, which is a pretty horrible story as it were, because most of the divine wiping everything out does occur in the Noah story. But the idea that there's one redemptive family, we can talk about that another time. So in my mind, whoever wrote this, remember, they didn't write it for the Bible. It's a text that came into the Bible, wasn't written for the Bible. It competes with all of the other ancient Near Eastern myths. And when I read those ancient Near Eastern myths, they're not as moving as this. They're not as powerful as this. It's not as subtle as this. The dramatic arc of the human beings does not come close to the story of the Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel. This is great literature, but it leads us toward divine despair, divine nihilism, which I think for sentient people who reflect on history, reflect on the human condition, we are oftentimes led to the same place. I remember when was an existentialist when I was in high school. I certainly felt nihilistic. I felt existentialist. Probably for the reasons of my own personal biography, the things small scale suffering when I was a kid, but it certainly gave to me a very dour sense of the human condition, the possibilities for human transformation. And I thought, I'm just a stranger here in a cold and heartless universe, and there's no way through. When I was in ninth, 10th grade, I read Camus and I read Sartre, and I was a committed existentialist. It's a cold, heartless universe that completely lacks meaning. And we're here, and to paraphrase Thomas Hobbes, it's going to be uh, life is going to be what did you say? Life will be short with poverty. What did you, oh, Thomas Hobbes. Um, Violent, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Violent, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Thomas Hobbes. I hadn't read Thomas Hobbes, but I would have agreed with it. And then, of course, I had my own the revelations that I discovered that brought me toward what I'm not going to call faith, meaning faith in theology, but a sense of attachment to the divine. Last thing I want to say before I open to any questions: if you don't read the New York Times frequently, please look at David Brooks' article today. Has anybody seen it by raise of hands? Okay. It's extraordinary. David Brooks, what probably one of my favorite writers today, if not my favorite. Um, he writes an article where he says it begins something like this: "I didn't know that this is what faith would feel like." So apparently, David Brooks, who's what I would call a very decent, morally intact, not angry, insightful writer who knew about religion and spirituality. He wrote about it, but was never in it. Something happened to him. He's finding in this column. He said, I didn't become faith is in sense of theology, so he'd fit right in with us. But I discovered meaning. I discovered transcendence. And it is one of the most moving things I have read in recent history, aside from my history, aside from poetry. It is an exquisite declaration of a man who's discovered the life of spirit and what it has done to him. Um, please read this. So, just having read that yesterday and preparing for today, it felt a perfect kind of synchronicity. What happens when you feel the despair? Okay. Now, the despair can be utter blackness, utter tohu. There's no redemption. There's no exit, as Sartre would say. And then a spark arrives. A spark arrives where there is meaning, there is goodness. It's not it's not a cultural artifact. It's not relativistic. That spark there is goodness, there's holiness, which leads to love, justice, truth, and beauty is real. And we are commanded, urged by the divine. We have a duty to expand that in the world. So, I read Brooks and I was preparing for today. I went to this divine nihilism. I remembered my own nihilism, and I remember a spark of me that said, no, that's not the end of the story. It's not meaningless. It's not empty. It's not cold. It's not heartless. I felt as a young person, I went all the way, and something in me said, that's actually not the end of it. There's something here. And again, using the idea of mitzvah, we have a duty to find it. It may be hidden, right? As the author of 119, Psalm 119, Psalm 9 says. He says it's hidden. But to say that it's hidden means that you know that it's there. So I, like many of you, I went through a moment of this crisis of nihilism, crisis of meaninglessness, and I said to myself, but it's there. I will find it. And of course, that's what led me on a path. So I'm here tonight talking to you. All right, that's my summary of the first Torah portion.